Good late morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Truly appreciate it. My name is Gina Lopez. I'm the Rural and Indigenous Community Specialist with the Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault. First and foremost, I'm a member of the Ute Mountain Tribe, located in Towaoc, Colorado. Today, I am very honored to be broadcasting to you all from the incredible tribal community of the Southern Ute Indian Tribe in Ignacio, here with my good friend Kelsey. So I'm going to take us through an overview really quickly. This is going to be a really long conversation. Hopefully that's how it's going to feel to everybody. We're going to start with a discussion about land acknowledgements. We're going to talk about sexual assault, aftermath and disruption, systems response, a jurisdiction, some advocacy considerations, some things to think about, some resources and resistance, what that looks like, what that can look like. And we're going to touch upon decolonization and restorative justice. And we're going to wrap up with hopefully what will be a call to action. I do want to start out by giving everybody a chance to, and really want to thank Kelsey for always making sure to look out for everybody. Again, just another reminder to take care of yourself. We're going to be talking about some very traumatic things, some triggering things. There's no easy path through this discussion. So whatever your practices are, your grounding, your self-care, your spiritual practices, definitely encouraging you to lean into that right now. I also want to kind of share with you what my grounding will be today, and that will be based in where I am right now here in Ignacio. Today I'm going to think about and center the children and the family that I have close relation to here. I am an aunt, I am a niece, I am a sister, I am a daughter in many ways in family here in Ignacio, including my home community of Towaoc, and also sending prayers and good thoughts to relatives and friends in our Northern Ute community of Fort Duchesne. I also want to share with you a little bit of my background. I was a program coordinator and advocate for tribal victim services for the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe. So that's my background. And then I found my way here into CCASA. My position has always been a remote one. So even before COVID and all of these work from home changes that we're now experiencing, I was always working from home, which has been a really great blessing. And has also its own obstacles. It was important for me to remain based in my foundation. So, being home, being close to my family, my relatives, and my people, being close to the work has been very pivotal to my work going forward. And so I say this to say that these are, they're going to be liberties and criticisms that I'm going to take part in based on my experiences and my identity. These are things that maybe only I could bring voice to in some regards. And this is an important part of this discussion we're going to have today, in that, you yourself may find yourself with these stories, with your own experiences, and wondering, how to voice them, where to voice them. And I'm hoping that this is a discussion that will help you think through that process some more. I don't come to you with the answers. I'm learning myself every day. I practice really hard to keep safe the stories that I hold in the cases that I provided advocacy services in and support. And so I will do my best to walk with as much grace and mindfulness as possible, and try to do my best to know that I am working every day to put these stories away in a good place, to continue to do my work. And that's also a component of advocacy that we will explore later in this discussion. So with that said, we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to focus on sexual assault and how that plays out in our tribal communities, but also know that, you know, we are holding space for all Indigenous identifying relatives, and can also apply to experiences to survivorship on and off the reservation. I'm sharing with you right now the tribal flags of the Southern Ute Tribe, the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, and the Northern Ute Tribe, just to, again, highlight and lift up our Ute nations here in our country. So here's a land acknowledgement. I know that this has kind of come up as being practiced a lot more. You'll probably see in presentations that center around social justice, around advocacy, in many ways, in land advocacy and resources and environmental. And now we're kind of seeing that kind of come forward. And so I like to always start my presentations with an acknowledgement for where we are here in the state of Colorado. It has held, it's held the healing and medicine and comfort of home to many tribal nations, some of whom are listed here. There are definitely others who aren't listed here, but just wanting to hold that honor up and make sure that we're practicing that acknowledgement, especially with our non-Native, non-Indigenous coworkers, colleagues, friends. We continue to remember our connection to Earth and our protection and caretakers, which is our role as Native and Indigenous peoples. This is important. A lot of these subjects that we're going to, it will feel like we're flying through a lot, and we are. All of these could be pulled out and be their own segments. We could talk all day on probably every single slide we're going to go through here. So I also am going to ask for your grace and understanding in that if I seem to skip over an aspect of something that you know in your heart and in your experience, there's more to that, you are very correct. But in the time constraint that we have, we're going to do our best to get through these things in a respectful way. So this is specific to our Ute tribes, what was considered to be our original homelands. You'll see that it encompassed much of Colorado and other states surrounding. And through all of the policies, removal, colonization, all of those experiences, you'll see what is now present day Ute lands or reservations. And you'll see there's the three bands, the three sister tribes that include southwestern Colorado and Utah. we're missing in there a little bit the White Mesa community that also lies in southeast Utah, that is a part of the Ute Mountain Tribe. So I want to share with you all part of land acknowledgement. There's this app out that's helping to kind of bring that recognition and acknowledgement out, making it accessible to wherever you are. Anybody can access this. It's an app. You can put in where you are, use your location, and it will pull up for you whose lands historically you are standing on. This is still a working app. I've used it a little bit just to kind of get a feel for it. It's a really neat app and just really interesting and important to see this this lens being applied to technology, and is a great part of continuing our acknowledging who we are and making sure that we are we're always practicing that, and really bringing our history into kind of modern day technology. It's a pretty powerful move. But again, it's a working app. They're still taking information from folks who have corrections for what comes up, but I still think it's a really great step in a really good direction. So we're going to go into our next part of the discussion around sexual assault, the aftermath and disruptions. We'll see why we call it disruptions here in a bit. So here is a really great quote from Peter Levine. Until we understand that traumatic symptoms are physiological as well as psychological, we will be woefully inadequate in our attempts to heal them all. And this is really touching on neurobiology. I know that Kelsey's had a lot of segments of sexual violence in the symposium, and I'm sure everybody has touched upon it in their own way. But also this is a part of a disruption in our spirituality. So not only physiological and psychological, but spiritual. As Native peoples, that is something that is also very intricate to who we are. And when we discuss neurobiology, for me, I make that connection to the spiritual experiences that are also involved in violence and trauma. So, again, this is kind of these are the connections that come up for me when we talk about this neurobiology of trauma. These responses we see: flight, fight, or freeze. The indigenous kind of way in which that we experience this is, a disruption of our sacred bodies, of our sacred spirit, things that are held in such high regard. Our bodies, our autonomy, what we will to be, to happen to our bodies, on our bodies. Sexual assault and rape, these are, codified labels for a systems response. So laws, arrests, law enforcement, that's where sexual assault and rape kind of really refer to in describing this type of violence. And in our practices and in our lives, in our tribal communities, there are no words for sexual assault. There's no words for rape. And we may wonder why that is. We have to think about where did these things come from in our history. Crime and violence and sexual violence specifically wasn't something that was seen a whole lot, if at all. And we're going to explore that a little bit more. I wanted to share this with you, and we're going to talk a lot about this. We're going to talk a little bit about this group later in the presentation. This is, if you see at the center, and I apologize for this graphic not being of the greatest quality, but you'll see those lightning strikes in there. This disruption of the world. This is to represent the survivor and their family and their community, right? So it's this crashing, this tearing apart of their being, their home, their safety, their sense of self, their spirit, and the assault does that. And all of these rings around it, these are levels of support to help bring some balance, some harmony and healing back to this survivor and to their family and hopefully to their community. Because as Native and Indigenous people, and a transgression on a person so violent like sexual assault, that it has ripple effects, it affects all of us. And it's going to take this network of care and honor and response to help work towards that harmony and healing piece. This graphic comes to you all from an incredible group of folks. They're called the Navajo, Apache, Ute, Hopi, and Zuni Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Family Violence. They are a multi-tribal, multidisciplinary group of folks, and we'll talk about that later. And they're a really incredible group of people that I'm so very honored to talk about today. And our good friend Kelsey is also one of them. So if we talk about first interaction, we talk about colonization, and we talk about even in modern times, and we do training, we do this bit of community education about what sexual assault is, what rape is, and it's about control. So, it's rooted in this first contact, this conquering that happened to our people through violence, genocide, through disease. But rape was really about putting control and a power over an entire people. So it's rooted in oppression, keeping one down, keeping one in a certain level to continue to exert their control, their ideals, their perception and lens of what future is what it is to look like. And so we see this through these experiences we had through colonization, like the residential and boarding school experience. We see a lot of those stories coming forward now, and we're very thankful to those incredibly courageous relatives who found their way, and also hold space for those who haven't and who might not ever. And then we'll talk a little bit more about this too, the ineffective criminal justice approach to sexual assault in our tribal communities. We are making some really great headway, which only comes from those folks before us, those survivors before us who do the work, who put their stories out there and help pave that pathway for advocacy to make its way into this conversation, for folks like myself and Kelsey to sit in these places to advocate for our relatives and for other, for Indigenous survivorship. It's a long road, it's very daunting, but again, always wanting to hold space for hope and for that resiliency. So let's talk a little bit about the systems response and jurisdiction aspect. So you'll see this a lot. This is something I would definitely, along with all the complexities that is our life, our experiences, our home, jurisdictional mazes. This is very foundational to what our experiences will be as a survivor of violence, and why this is kind of a part of the component of why it's really difficult to see justice, to define justice, and to really talk about in terms of, you know, this is the path you must follow. This is the way that it works. It's different every single time, with every single experience, every single story. It's different every time. But these are some very important pieces to remember in wondering why and how we got to this place. So the Major Crimes Act, which allows federal government authority over crimes such as rape, that's still in place today. Public Law 280, which passed federal jurisdiction to states. That's not something that's a consideration right now for Colorado. We are not a PL 280 state. For the tribal nations that do reside in states that are PL 280 states, they have another complexity, another turn in the maze for how rape will be prosecuted for them. The Oliphant versus Suquamish, 1978, eliminated tribal criminal jurisdiction over anyone who was not a member of their tribe or of a tribe. And then VAWA 2013, which is the Special Domestic Violence Criminal Jurisdiction. And we're going to dive into those. So, you know, you can definitely look these up, do your research. I cannot emphasize that enough. If you're going to be an advocate in tribal communities, if you're going to advocate for a survivor from tribal communities, if their assault happened in tribal communities, you will need to be almost a paralegal. You almost need to also be an expert in all of these pieces of legislation and policies. So the federal government, they felt that tribes were ill-equipped and under-resourced, which we will hearken back to later in this view of how tribes can and cannot respond to and prosecute crimes, specifically violent ones, to develop meaningful or at least better ways to address major crimes in their lands and among their own people. So the government taking this away, taking this power away from tribes and saying that their way is better. That's something to keep in mind when we have a discussion about what decolonization is about. So an Indigenous response to that is, you know, the first documented form of response to violence against Native women placed all decisions, not some consideration, but all decisions in the ways of holding someone who violated the sacredness of her body. And we're going to hold space also for our men and boys and our Two-Spirit LGBTQ survivors as well, of their body. So this is a quote from our good friend Sarah Deer, what she will, it be so. So this is just this, again, the way in which traditionally things were handled when this type of violation happened, was left in the hands of the survivor to decide what those consequences would be. And as a people, the tribe, the community would uphold that. So again, a quick discussion about Public Law 280. So states and federal government knew better than tribes and Native victims and survivors, how to address their own victimization. So neither state nor tribal governments consented to this arrangement. Tribal and state governments were not provided the resources to enforce those crimes. So again, pulling away further and further, piece by piece, that say, and placing upon tribal communities how good you were, how much better you needed to be in order to respond to and prosecute these crimes. And Oliphant in 1978 held that protection extends over certain defendants and diminish the sovereignty of tribes, furthering the colonized perception that not only are tribes unable to effectively address violence in their own lands, also they dare not have say over non-Indian defendants. This, again, opening vulnerabilities that compound the traumas in our communities and directly impact the missing and murdered epidemic. This is all of these aspects we can find connection to this issue of the missing and murdered. But I just want to make sure that we're holding space for that as we walk through these. And our most recent policy is VAWA 2013. And now they say you can hold those non-Indian defendants accountable, and you must do so only in this way to count, or you cannot do it at all. So the special domestic violence requirement is almost a ground up building of a whole new process within tribal courts to address violence in non-Indian defendant cases. So a lot of tribes are lucky to have a court at all, and struggle with the resources to provide adequate representation, adequate victim consideration in prosecuting cases. And so what VAWA did was say, sure, you can do this, but we also need to see these things. So it's almost like a rebuilding. So what they're asking you for is, as a tribal court, is you have to supply adequate representation for the defendant. They need to have all of the rights and privileges that they would find in a court off tribal reservation land in order for you to hold this person accountable for domestic violence charges against them. So, I'm not a legal expert. These are things that I picked up along the way in my experiences. Definitely do your own research, pick up on any, and they're out there a lot of the time, pick up on any opportunities to jump in on webinars where we have some legal experts to really pull these things out for you and help you understand what that really means. Complicated, complex is really the takeaway. And even if you get it down, there's always a lot more to it. And, we find that the hurdles, they seem to come down. Right? Like VAWA looks like we're making some changes there. And actually, they present other different ones. So say all that to say, always hold that space for hope. This took a long time, a lot of advocacy, a lot of incredible organizational push from many tribes and many individuals and survivors, but we still have a long way to go. So, this is a definition for tribal sovereignty, which is a tribe's right and power to govern itself and its members. That's a huge part of that to remember, without interference from any other government, right? Another tribe, states, local and federal. But just refer back to what we just discussed, what we just talked about, those decisions and those policies that we just covered. And, you know, it's really different when we think about what tribal sovereignty should be. It should be all of these things, but we saw in each of those places where there was that interruption, there was some interference there was some efforts in there to say, this was good, this wasn't good enough, this is better, this is who you can prosecute, this is who you can't, this is what you need to do it now. So tribal sovereignty and having sovereignty when it comes to sexual violence and domestic violence is a very complicated issue. Lots of unpacking to do there. So today, I want us to, you know, look at the impact of sovereignty in terms of its people, specifically when they become, you know, survivors or victims of crime. Sovereignty greatly impacts jurisdiction, location of the assault, as well as the body of the victim, who they are, of the survivor, is also jurisdiction. This is something that's very different in the experiences of a survivor in sexual assault in tribal communities. Do we have any questions or anything right now, Kelsey? Just do a quick check-in. And it's okay if not. And it's okay if not, we can definitely hold some time at the end.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, you're more than welcome to put them in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourself at this point. If there aren't any, then we'll just move forward.
Cool. Thank you, Kelsey. She'll keep an eye on that for me. So, all that said, right, advocacy. What does this mean in advocacy? So many things. I say a lot. I could probably write 5 books just off the top of my head right now. I was telling Kelsey on my way here, I was thinking of slides that I was missing in putting this together. I'm still working this particular presentation. But, you know, I do want to mention prevalence, which means the rate in which these things happen. That's not a slide I put in here, probably because we see it all the time. We see it in stats. We see it in, you know, outreach efforts. You know, 2 in 3, 1 in 3. We see a lot of these statistics. I really want to encourage us to really think about that. Speaking for myself, I cannot think of a woman in my family who has not been a survivor of violence, domestic violence, sexual violence. So, you know, when we talk about rates and when we see rates like that, really hold that space for unreported. There's a lot of things that we don't see, a lot of stories we don't hear about, a lot of cases that don't get reported, and really think about why that is. We're gonna journey through some of that here in a bit. And our boys and our men are also survivors and victims of sexual violence and sexual assault. Thinking about why we don't hear about that, why we don't talk about that. Again, that could be a whole segment of webinar too, about masculinity and how we hold space for our men and boys so that they feel safe to talk about their vulnerabilities, to talk about their experiences, because we are missing a lot of those stories and a lot of that consideration. But just in your advocacy, you know, just remember to hold that space. And then also for our LGBTQ two-spirit relatives who face and experience sexual violence in rates that we may never really get a full handle upon. And then just think about how they intersect with all of the rest of these components we're going to talk about in here, and how that is an added barrier, added trauma, and added need for us to believe and hold space. So just wanting to make sure to put that in there. So here are some, but not all, the barriers to services. And we're going to unpack some of these, not all of them. So, historical trauma, seeking medical care, fear of retaliation, confidentiality, location and access, and relationships. So this historical trauma is also another segment that could be its own, webinar series. Definitely want to shout out some incredible sisters like my good friend Elena Giacchi, who does a phenomenal job really unpacking historical trauma, and has a really great skill about her in telling this story and making it accessible for all of us. And you'll see in here, this is something that I pulled from, and I've heard her content lots of times, enough times to know that there are some things that we need to center and lift up, which is that Indigenous, Native trauma is not in any way, shape, or form historical. It's not history. It's still happening today. It's happening right now. Some parts of this is normalized violence, right? Why don't we talk about it so much? Why is it taboo? Why are we having such a struggle with our leadership understanding this need that we have for more effective responses, more effective supportive services, more effective prosecution, and if anything, just more effective honor around this very, very destructive violence to our people. And understanding that through all of the history of our tribal communities, the genocide, the relocation, blood quantum policies, all of these things have normalized violence and its impacts upon us. And so, again, just remembering that, historical trauma still plays out in a lot of these practices. Internalized oppression. So, lateral violence. This is something that has existed for a long time. And we're just now, getting some really great content, some really great teaching, resources, and a name to talk about this internalized oppression, what all of this normalized violence and then this trauma, how it shows up in our relationships with each other, how we work with each other. So lateral violence is really all of the kind of, the way in which we are acting out our oppression onto each other, rather than looking at it through the scope of where does this come from? Who taught us violence? Who taught us rape? Who taught us indifference, right? So instead, I'm going to gossip about my sister. I'm going to gossip about my coworker. I'm going to, I'm going to compete, for a job. I'm going to compete for a pay. I'm going to deny this person, services in my program because they've, had this interaction or, argument with a member of my family or with me, right? So this whole this way in which we feel powerless to put the responsibility of this this feeling we have, which is oppression, to where it really belongs, but rather kind of what's easier for us. So each other. So tribal government and department silos, again, you know, misunderstanding of trauma-informed survivor-led services. And, you know, this is the part where I can say I speak to this myself in my experiences in, you know, in working a program in my community. Silos, you know, just kind of, if we think back on that, that graphic I showed you of the disruption for the survivor, for the victim, and that network of care, right? That's important to restore that balance and harmony. That doesn't work with siloed departments, with all of those components stuck to themselves. And it became a you know, a challenge, and, you know, an everyday challenge just to get one of those components to work with the other. As the person in the middle of that, you know, we start to see where those things disconnect, and we see what causes and opens up gaps, and where our, you know, where our survivors find their way falling through. And another component of that is who's telling our stories and defining us in our tribal departments and our, you know, our government, right? Are we in a place where we're sharing our survivor stories and our experiences with our leadership so that we can help define or redefine or reimagine or you know, just acknowledge these needs, and why silos just are not going to work anymore. And again, silos are part of that lateral violence, this internalized oppression of feeling like we need to hold on to scarce resources in such a way that we become ineffective to our own people. So that's a part of that, and how our grants are written, who they apply to. Do they look like what we're seeing here in our everyday life, in our communities? A lot of the times they don't. And when you're there as a provider of those services, your hands are tied a lot of the time, and happened long before you even came into your job. And that's found in, you know, yet another form of this lens telling us what is the better way for us to take care of each other in our communities. We doing okay on time? Okay. So seeking medical care. So, you know, there's shame and embarrassment because we still are working towards holding space of believing and supporting a survivor. So, you know, there's not wanting to come to a doctor's office to say, this is what's happened to me, to say, this is what I need. This is what I need care for. I want to, give a shout out to, Bethany, who came on last week and gave a really great presentation of what to expect when you come in for an examination with a forensic nurse. Incredible providers who are really working towards better ways in which to provide services, and also to really center culturally specific considerations when they provide that care. Mistrust or lack of confidence in the system. That also can stem from this historical generational trauma of, so if we think back in Indian health services and forced sterilization, and that's something that imprints upon us, right? That's also part of the historical generational trauma that we're talking about. Is those things may have happened generations ago, but they are imprinted on our DNA, they're imprinted on our spirituality. And so though I might not have experienced forced sterilization. It's still in the threading of who I am and in what I trust, that tells me to hesitate. And so again, thinking about where that comes from and asking our providers to, to hold space for that. It's a very real part of our experiences in tribal communities. Even though our health systems, our medical services have come a ways from that, but we're still seeing a little bit of that today, right? In what we're hearing about happening. So it's still, again, it's not always history. We still see components of these things happening today. So fear of retaliation from perpetrators and their families. We're all related to each other here in our tribal communities. And when we talk about prevalence, we'll see a rate that also talks about, who is perpetrating, who is the defendant in these cases. In a national conversation, a lot of the time, it's a person who is not a member of your community. It's a person who is not a native. But here in our tribal communities, that's very different. We know a lot of the time we're related to them. A lot of the time they're our partner. And a lot of the time they live in our community with us. And so do their families. And so when we think about our tribal medical services, when we think about who we have that fear of retaliation from, that's a part of things to think about when you are advocating for, if you're understanding, advocating for a survivor of sexual assault. And then lack of sane services or knowledge of services. So again, getting presentation out and information from a forensic nurse like Bethany is so important in helping us overcoming or at least confronting one of these barriers, which is that lack of services and that lack of knowledge of those services. Here's something I wanted to bring folks' attention to, just to help. Again, we're always working towards giving control back to survivors, control back to our people. So this is called DORA. This exists here in Colorado. It may exist in other states as well. I'm not versed on what that might look like in other states, but here in Colorado, we have DORA, which is the Department of Regulatory Agencies. And here you can look up a professional license. So your doctor, your medical provider. I have looked up my new provider at my Indian Health Clinic in Towaoc, and you can put in their name and their profession. If you have their license number, if you scroll down more, you can also add that too. But usually their first and last name is sufficient, and it will pull up for you whether they've ever had their license suspended, or if they've ever had any kind of a misconduct. Just again, a way in which to give you some control back over who you see and what you know about your medical provider. And I think is important for those of us in our tribal communities, especially when we think about distrust in Indian health services and where that comes from. Just again, this continuing forward work in these kind of what would you call watchdogs, these components to again oversee this, a response to misconduct, a response to sexual violence, even by folks that we should be putting our trust in, like our medical providers. It's just a really neat and important feature to have. So Fear of retaliation. Again, close relationships, survivor being known to law enforcement, to tribal systems. Oh, I'm sorry, this was supposed to be kind of like a compare. So close relationships, for us, through the lens of, community member, this is our care for our relatives, known to law enforcement and tribal systems, right? This is a stigma and leads to that, unbelievable survivor, having that struggle to believe in this person because of their experiences being known to law enforcement and to, programs, right? So we're thinking about folks who have been arrested before for other crimes, substance abuse, mental health issues, all of these experiences we have, though we can tie them to, to those historical traumas, and even just, the struggles that we have in our tribal communities. All of that can add to the stigma and this, this struggle to be believed. Member versus non-member in terms of survivors. What we should be looking at, how we should be viewing this is a care for our visitors, a care for our relatives, a care for our friends. Should not matter whether or not you're a member or a non-member. But I can speak from experience that it does, right? It matters. And again, is this work that we need to do to share our stories and advocate to our leadership for better ways in which we hold space in a victim-centered, survivor-led way. And then the scarcity of resources, right? Lots of things are scarce to our communities, especially now in the time of COVID. I think we're feeling that on a global level now, right? But as when we're looking at that in terms of, survivors of sexual assault in our communities, what this does when scarcity of resources is our excuse, this expands vulnerabilities to our community as a whole. When we're trying to check all the boxes of our grant funding and we're trying to stay within range and we're trying to, juggle member versus non-member in terms of how much of our time and our programming can we afford out to a survivor, thinking about what that does to us as a people as a whole, not just to that survivor. Even if that survivor was a visitor to our community and was assaulted, it is never their fault that they came there, and nobody expects to be raped. Nobody expects to be violated in such a way. And when we view this through the lens of, scarcity and resources, it really changes, who we are as Indigenous people, as Native people, as relatives. Really looks like what we see outside of our spiritual homes. It is it's in a lot of, non-Indian in the white way to kind of balance and quantify a person, a whole spirit of a person in such a way. And so that's how I'm going to dive into that a little bit, and hope that you sit with that and think about how that plays out. Location of services. So transportation hardships. We are a lot of, our tribal communities are located in places, and, as we saw through that really quick kind of change where our lands were historically to where we ended up, it's on purpose. We are in very remote locations. We are in places that are hard to get to. We are in places that it's hard to find things that we need. So that's a barrier. Call ahead to make sure that where you're going to go for your medical services, that they're going to be available. Call ahead to the shelter if that's where you're trying to go, just to make the better use and the most efficient use of your time and of your gas. Think about how, if you're a tribal advocate, think about how your advocacy policies and procedures interact with law enforcement. Things being shared in the car ride might be used in court depending on what kind of program or what kind of advocate you are. We'll discuss that here in a couple of slides. And I also wanted to shout out a mapping project that we're working on at CCASA. Shout out to my incredible intern, Sarah, who did a lot of important work making contact with folks here in Colorado. And we'll keep you posted on how that progresses. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So what this will be, this is just a graphic. This is not what it'll look like, but just letting you know kind of what it is that we did. So we made contact through phone, through email, through two agencies, member agencies. We started with member agencies of CCASA who knew of resources that were specific to Native American Indigenous survivors. And we just started kind of compiling this data. And we will be moving this into an online viewable feature. And we'll also include providers and resources found through through NAUHZCASA, the multi-tribal, multidisciplinary group that I talked about. So that will also include providers and resources in Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. So recognize that victims may fear and distrust government and tribal systems, including you, if you're an advocate in a tribal community. Really be mindful of your positional power. You might be a member of the community, you might live in that community, but just you also hold a power over others. In that role where you are an advocate and you are speaking to things, speaking to people, speaking to systems in a way that a lot of your community members may not have. And that was something that became very real to me very quickly when I started working our program in my previous position. Being able to hold this power, again, it also comes with really important responsibility in what you do with that. Recognize the way that your tribal organization is set up. Where are you placed in your program, in your tribal organization? Keep that in mind. Your work with law enforcement and conflict of interest. These all might be reasons why survivors may not trust you, may fear coming to your program, and all of those things. And when I say yes, you can, I say that, this was something that I also hesitated in my experience of doing because, excuse me, I'm from that community. So, everybody knows me, I know everybody. And thinking about, can I support this person who's also my relative? If we get through all of these barriers and they've said, yes, I'm comfortable with you. Again, always being survivor led. If the survivor is okay with it and they prefer you, maybe. And you might be the only one. You might be the only advocate there. And even if that's the case, really work as best you can to gather information that the survivor may need. so that they might be able to advocate for themselves if they don't feel comfortable with you and you're the only one. Do everything you can to empower the survivor to navigate this very complicated journey. And of course, you know, all the resources available to healing and restoring the survivor. They may not get the justice that they are seeking. That was very rare. Even in my experience, justice looks different for every single story, every single case. But the journey towards healing, I feel, is always the same. And you can't give away too many resources to help a person define what that journey is going to look like for them. So just a quick kind of compare and contrast of what kind of advocate you might be. Are you a system-based advocate? Are you a community-based advocate? In tribal communities, that can be very ambiguous, and it can also be very problematic. And here are a couple of reasons why. So a system-based advocate works closely with a law enforcement department. They might even be located within a law enforcement department. And a community-based advocate, you know, they work in understanding with law enforcement. So it's a working relationship, and they might not work as closely. A system-based advocate might also be working with the courts, working with the prosecutor. As a community-based advocate, as far as courts go, you probably accompany, you probably help navigate, just kind of help support and give some really good kind of things to be prepared for with the survivor as a community-based advocate. Assistant-based advocate, and this is a huge part of it, may not have or have limited confidential privilege and may be subject to a subpoena. So anything said to assistant-based advocate can be used in court and can be shared with everybody in the court. So the defendant, the judge, the jury, whereas a community-based advocate is a confidential information holder. There are some caveats to that, unless that community-based advocate is aware that there is a plan to harm oneself or another person or a child or an elder or an adult who has vulnerabilities is at risk of being harmed. And then subject to subpoena depends on tribal code. And that was something that I had tested in my experience. And I added this quick, this is in Colorado, and this is a code, and I will have this resource available to Kelsey to post to you all, and you can look this up about what it means to be a confidential advocate here in Colorado. So what comes with it is just this understanding that advocates, community-based advocates cannot be subpoenaed, cannot be forced to share what was shared with them, except with those caveats, of course. And then what training advocacy hours are required for this advocate to hold in order to fall under this, provision. So be aware of and work to overcome stereotypes associated with being an Indian, being a Native, and Native women in particular. And also, again, holding that space for our LGBTQ two-spirit folks and our men and boys. So working with non-tribal agencies and systems, that's going to be there. You are also of the identity of the survivor. So you'll be there working in tandem with non-tribal agencies, knowing that you hold this identity. Re-victimization is perpetrating stereotypes. So you yourself, you perpetrate these stereotypes. It's also a form of re-victimization for the survivor. You do not have to deny your own identity. You know, if anything, lean into that. You being a tribal, being a Native Indigenous person as an advocate are already forming this model of resiliency. You don't have to deny your identity to do your job, even though you may be working in a lot of these processes with folks who do not look like you and do not share your journey or your experiences. Build transparent and strength-based partnerships. So, you know, again, knowing what kind of advocate you are, knowing, understanding, you know, which in these systems that you're working in, you know, who are your allies, and allies versus co-conspirator. This was something I pulled away from a discussion that I had taken part in through a webinar. There's a difference, you know, allies, you know, hold space for you. Co-conspirators, you know, they want to push things forward with you. And again, that can be a whole other segment. Maybe Kelsey and I can put that together for you all and see what we can do with that. But just really know, you know, who your partners are. What kind of partners are they? And, you know, practice mindfulness and how you walk with the people and for yourself. So how you interact with someone has lasting impressions, right? And we're going to make mistakes. I could probably write double as many books about my experiences only on the mistakes that I made. There were a lot. And I've learned a lot. And it's okay. Explain your role and your boundaries. So, you know, when you work with a survivor, you know, talk about, you know, what things you're there for, what you can do, and be very honest and clear about that, especially about your boundaries. This I cannot do, especially when we're working in our own community. You know, you have to hold those boundaries for your own sanity, right? Your home, your safety, your well-being, for your longevity, for your resiliency. You know, hold space for your different roles and how others are going to perceive you, especially our relatives. So that's an experience that, you know, I definitely can share with you about. You know, there became this distance between myself and my relatives because of the work that I was doing. Kind of this suspicion or this fear, you know, that I was going to tell on you know, things that I was seeing, because, you know, we're working through some things in our families, we're working through things in our communities. And, you know, if I didn't experience them myself, if I didn't know they were going on, you know, I wouldn't have felt so strong to step into the role as an advocate. And so, you know, really opening up that conversation with your relatives about, this is what I do. These are the things, you know, I have to do in my role, you know, in my job and how I do my job, because it has to do with how I serve everyone in our community. So if I see, you know, child neglect, child abuse, if I know about it, you know, I have to tell, right? So, you know, being open and transparent about that. What things do you have to tell about? What things do you have a duty, you know, to report? And talk about that. Talk about why that's important. It was a brand new experience. A lot of the talks that I had in being an advocate, you know, we're talking with my relatives, were conversations that I had never heard any of them have before in my life. And I think that it was very healthy and important for us to really, you know, acknowledge, you know, what's going on in our family, acknowledge that, you know, what I was doing and the work that I was going to do. We might be sitting in opposite ends of things, and that, you know, we're still relatives. We can't change that. And if something should happen, I would be there for you too, to support you. So, you know, I see a lot of that in my experience. Somebody that I work with as a survivor of a crime can be in another, you know, in another instance, be the defendant in that crime. And that, you know, and that can rotate out because of the cycles of violence and, you know, and struggles and challenges that we have in our communities. And finally, but always should be first and foremost, take care of your spirit, right? You know, before I left home, you know, said a quick prayer, because I know I was going to be speaking on things that were not going to be easy, that were going to be, you know, woven through experiences of other survivors and stories that I, you know, I hold and have the honor of holding probably for the rest of my life. You know, definitely, you know, thank you to Kelsey for, you know, doing what she needed to do. I can smell some really good vibes in here, and I appreciate that. It's very comforting to feel that, because in a lot of ways, when you are practicing advocacy, you know, you're practicing a form of healing, regardless of what kind of advocate you are. And in the same care that we would step into a healing circle or a healing ceremony is really something that, you know, in learning mistakes. And if, you know, if I could, you know, and this is why I'm sharing with you, to bestow upon you something that I, you know, I really wish I could have had the capacity and the, you know, the perception of stepping back away from it and seeing, you know, what should have been very center and should have been, you know, very important to, you know, providing those services, was that in a way that we heal in ceremony is really closely related to how advocacy should, you know, should be provided for survivors in our tribal communities. So this is a rhetorical question, but if you'd like to, you know, throw something in the chat box, that's also welcomed. You know, do you know where or who to contact for guidance in advocacy services to one of your relatives or for yourself? I'm gonna just give a couple of minutes. You don't have to answer that. I just throw that in there so I could take a quick breath and have some water. Kelsey, do you want to see if there's anything going on?
Yeah, I'll be looking in the chat and I'll let you know if anybody's saying anything.
Thank you. We're going to go into a discussion about resources and resistance. So, excuse me, shout out to some tribal coalitions here in our region. In Utah, we have Restoring Ancestral Winds. In Arizona, we have the Southwest Indigenous Women's Coalition. In New Mexico, we have the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women. And there are many nonprofits and you know, Indigenous women councils, things like that, that are, you know, also, you know, coming forward, which is incredible. Definitely hold space for that, but I just wanted to shout these folks out as being really kind of local and kind of my go-tos in searching out information, in tapping into sources of resiliency and resistance. So these are some really great coalitions. We'll be sure to get you all contact information, but these are all easily found on the web. These great coalitions. There's also, you know, national organizations as well. So this is NAUHZCASA. This is the Navajo, again, the Navajo, Apache, Ute, Hopi, Zuni Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Family Violence. This group has existed over 10 years. Currently, at CCASA, I provide technical assistance and just really some administrative things to the monthly meetings that happen. It has gone online, so these are web meetings now, which is really really been has been challenging, and has allowed these meetings to continue in order to support each other. And these are again, providers and advocates, nurses, health educators, law enforcement, our systems-based advocates, just the whole gamut of that network in that graphic that we saw of care you can all be found in NAUHZCASA, and is a really a beautiful formation of support and resiliency. I'm sure there's a lot more I can say, but this is just showing you kind of representation of NAUHZCASA, kind of what communities we're talking about, who's all in these. And this is just a graphic that we found. Does not necessarily mean these are specifically reservations. So, this is just to give you an idea of kind of who's all involved, why we meet. Again, crime has no true respect for boundaries and jurisdiction lines, state lines, and reservation lines. And so that's a lot of the reason why NAUHZCASA came together. Also, before COVID, we were meeting every month in all of those tribal communities. Something that was, it was a very important experience to have, because as we drove those long distances to each of these meeting places every month, it also represented the journey and the road that survivors and their advocates would have to take oftentimes to make it to that medical care, to take to get to an examination, to get to court, to get to a shelter. So that was an important part of the meetings every month that I miss a lot, but really is a great reminder of that journey. So, this is something that's very pivotal to NAUHZCASA, the coordinated community response model. So coordination, collaboration, communication, capacity building. We share, I also have to add, this is a non-funded, so there's no funds in NAUHZCASA. Folks who are involved make the time to do so. They volunteer their time to do so. Nobody gets paid, to do any of these things. It's something that is extra on top of all of the duties that everybody does. How we find time, I don't know. Just very grateful to CCASA and our board of directors who believe in NAUHZCASA and believe in supporting its being and its continuation. But so what happens is we share in resources, we share in trainings, a really great group of expertise and just phenomenal experts in tribal advocacy and tribal services can be found in NAUHZCASA. If you're looking for somebody who has a focus on an aspect of advocacy or services in tribal community, could definitely hook you up with one or a few folks who would have that available to give to you. So it's been a really it's been a really important honor to be a part of this group. I joined when I was an advocate and program coordinator for my tribe. So it's been a real experience to be able to continue to support tribal advocates and tribal providers, and our law enforcement partners as well. So here's also an aspect of NAUHZCASA, that the trauma of sexual assault can be healed. Love and human connection is a force for resiliency and recovery. So believing, supporting, being mindful of victim blaming behavior, victim blaming language, social networking to assist other survivors. And, I know I share an incredible survivor story from who sits in, receives information from NAUHZCASA, the survivor, and our sister, Becky Johnson, who I can't thank enough for finding the courage and the will to share her story. And it is shared far and wide, and really helps us to not only humanize survivorship, but to see ourselves in that, and to see ourselves in that courage. And the hope is that, that we are creating more and more of a safe space for survivors to come forward, whether you want to share your story or not. It's a really important part of healing, is to find your story and to see it in others. Building new personal goals that mirror this connectedness, for growth and that restoring harmony and balance. So you see that a lot in, you'll see that in survivor stories, and they're not complete. We're still working our survivor story, and we're still walking that journey. So, really holding that space for connectedness with each other can really be helpful. Just again, survivors, who felt that they lost their dignity and happiness, they can gain new energy, purpose, and meaning from healing. And a deeper appreciation of life can happen with spiritual growth. So I didn't add it in here because it like many aspects of this could be its own segment of, suicide and mental health, and how that plays into this, and again, the spirituality, and that disruption, really holding space and lifting up how real suicide becomes for survivors from sexual violence. How are we doing, Kelsey? 30 minutes. So I want to touch on decolonization and restorative justice. It's something that I'm also learning about myself, is also why this is a working presentation for me. I feel the more that I journey through this understanding, I really feel like I will have a lot more to kind of thread through my experiences, and hopefully bring more dynamics to teachable content like this. So here's a definition of what decolonized means, which is the process of deconstructing colonial ideologies of the superiority and privilege of Western thought and approaches. Now that's a lot, right? That's a lot to unpack. So for non-Indigenous people, decolonization is the process of examining your beliefs about Indigenous peoples and culture by learning about yourself in relationship to the communities where you live and the people with whom you interact. So for me, when I thought about what this means in advocacy, I think about all the ways in which, you know, we support each other and our grandmothers and their grandmothers and their grandmothers, how they supported each other in a holistic and spiritual way, and how through first contact and from that point forward, how all of those ways in which we used to, work with each other, heal with each other, and all of that, and care for each other was really pushed aside. Again, you know, that's not a good, we have a better way. We have a better way of doing that. We know we have processes, we have court, we have this and that. And even this, the way this content is being brought to you in this, in this slideshow. It's this way in which we need to organize thought. We need to organize teachings so that it's understandable. So this is how I'm going to form it, and I'm going to give it to you. But to decolonize that is to, think about how we share these stories, how we taught each other before we were given these frameworks in which to do it. So there's so many aspects of everything that we just talked about. If we applied that decolonized lens, could look a lot differently. And I threaded through some thoughts in there alluding to that, but it's definitely not all in there right now. Consent, sovereignty of our bodies, right? We've seen a lot of content about consent, seeking consent, talking about consent, respect of others' bodies, practice and culture norms. So in our culture, we tell our children a lot of the time, that's your uncle, that's your aunt, go kiss your cousin, especially around the holidays. We've done that a lot. But also what happens with that is, we've taken away autonomy already. We've taken away respect and sovereignty of, our kids' agency or their ability to, to say, who gets to interact with my body, who gets to touch me, and who, forcing, another form of conditioning and normalizing violence. So here's something I think, we can work on is normalizing practices of consent. And you can do this from babies till elders. We can start normalizing, asking for permission and, and honoring when we've been given permission and what that means. We see a lot of that really uninterrupted violation of consent a lot in our family dynamics, in our community dynamics. And so that's something we need to talk about in terms of, resiliency and, what it means to look at things through a decolonized lens. So restorative justice. It's an Indigenous concept, restoring a person, a community from an injustice. So this can be done through reparation, compensation, had been practiced in banishment or even death when transgressions happened in our communities. And today, we consider what and who has been affected by the assault. So, we take into consideration historical, generational traumas, ACEs scores. Bethany touched on that. That's a very important part of understanding sexual violence and trauma in the future. So, what kind of restorative justices could we practice, and how might that shape, the lives of our generations to come. And I want to invite you all to Restorative Justice Virtual Summit that we are putting together at CCASA, where we're going to explore restorative justice and sexual violence, which is going to include, work that's happening currently here in Colorado and in the country. So it'll be happening December 2nd through the 3rd. Excuse me. We also have a white paper that explores restorative justice in tribal communities from our policy department intern, Alex, which is really interesting. And I'm hoping to put that forward during the summit and to work on that. And really, I invite folks to consider looking into that and joining. There is a fee if you're not a member of CCASA, but you can always contact us to see what being a member might mean for you or your agency. So what can we do? First and always, believe and support survivors, voice action and change. So in your tribal laws and our codes, really advocate with our leaders. State bills and legislation, those things can still come into play to support survivors in our tribal communities, and federal and consultations. We've seen that come out this past year. Opportunities for members of our communities to get in on consultations about how funding is going to go. The presidential missing and murder task force, and then interruption of violence. So open up conversations in our homes about consent, about sexual violence, about, historical trauma. All of these things are connected. We have a lot of talking we can do as families and as communities. And we need to have these conversations, and we need to normalize having these conversations so that we can really embody sovereignty of not only our bodies, but of our community, of our land, of our resources, of each other. So that's an important aspect of call to action that we can definitely be working on and do better at. So these are some of the things that we ran through. I know it felt like a whirlwind. It definitely does for me. I appreciate you all sticking with me. This was a long conversation, discussion. And, I appreciate your time, and, again, take care of yourself, and, definitely reach out to Kelsey. You can reach out to me. Kelsey knows how to reach me. And you can reach me at Gina@CCASA.org. And I'm happy to have conversations with you if you'd like to dive into this a little bit more, unpack some other things. Or if you just like support, definitely here to do all of that. And definitely thank you for joining the symposium and these series of presentations. Also very important. Thank you to Say So and to Kelsey for putting this together, for pushing forward through COVID, and still making this happen. These are very important aspects and discussions for us all to still be having during this time.